Hello, everybody. I hope that you can all see and hear us, and welcome to Oxford. My name's Martin Maiden. I am the head of Department of Biology, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to our first Christmas lecture, which we are planning to become an annual event. This one, of course, is exclusively online, but next year we will have the excitement of being in the new Life and Mind building, which is nearing completion and which we're hoping to be moving to in the next 6 or 9 months. So this is going to become, as I say, a regular event, the Christmas lecture for alums, and in future, hopefully, it will be both live. So we'll have an event in the Life and Mind building, but we will also stream it. And thank you very, very much for joining. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here. The idea is to give you a flavour of what's going on in the department. And of course, we're very lucky today in we're going to have one of our many super excellent graduate students who, of course, are driving the research. The graduate students are an extremely important part of our research community, indeed, probably one that generates at the end of the day the most innovative research, if we're honest. We're very lucky to have Oliver joining us. We're extremely lucky to have Oliver in all sorts of ways, of course, not just because he's one of our current graduate students doing some research on an extremely topical subject, that of mistletoe, and one that I think I'm really looking forward to hearing it. But also, Oliver is a homegrown product. He did the undergraduate degree here. In fact, although he's an undergraduate who's been doing the degree in the era of the MBile year, the 4th year, he actually elected not to do that. He left the degree with his BA and went straight in to the doctoral training program, the NERC doctoral training program, in which he's studying plant, particularly mistletoe, which was a subject that absolutely fitted his interests. So he body swerved the MBile year and went straight in to the DPhil. He's doing that DPhil, as I say, funded by the NERC, but with Roberto Gomez, one of our academics, and also Chris Thorogood, who's the deputy director of the Oxford Botanic Gardens, and whom we have a great deal of collaboration with, an ongoing collaboration. So without more, I am now going to ask Ollie to share his talk, give his lecture to us, and then at the end, hopefully, we'll be finishing at 7 sharp, but hopefully we shall have some time for questions. So if you've got questions, you should see there's a Q&A box in the corner, and if you can add any questions that you have in there and put them in any time you like, and we'll get through as many of those as we can in the course of after the course is finished. So Ollie, over to you. Look forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that introduction, Martin. And it is lovely to be giving this lecture. And yes, very honoured that it's the first lecture for the biology alumni. Being an alumnus myself, I had a wonderful time here at my degree in Oxford, and it has projected me right into a project that I absolutely love. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the magic and mysteries of mistletoe. And quite a broad title, because I'm kind of going to be taking you on a tour around some science, some history, some culture surrounding this plant. Now, just as a brief introduction, yes, I'm co-supervised by Roberto Gomez here in the Department of Biology, so that makes me an ecologist, but I also work with Chris Thorogood at the Botanic Garden on the botanical aspects of this plant. So I try and cross disciplines a little bit, hopefully, as you'll see during this talk. Okay, so without further ado, lots of people, maybe some non-biologists in particular, will just lump mistletoe in with lots of other Christmas plants. So fir trees or Christmas trees, maybe poinsettias, they've got some very cool there. Holly, again, interesting plant, and then mistletoe, it's just another Christmas plant. You kiss under it, That might be the extent to which you know. Maybe you know a little bit more. Maybe you're a gardener. You've tried to grow some mistletoe your own yourself. But actually, what I want to convince you today is that mistletoe is not just for Christmas. It is actually a fascinating plant in so many ways. It's about as weird as the plant kingdom gets, and that's saying things. That's saying something, because there's some very, very weird plants out there. Okay, so hopefully I can change your mind that mistletoe is not just another Christmas plant. But we need to start by thinking, what actually is mistletoe? When we think about mistletoe, we typically think of the classic European mistletoe. So white berries, long, slender green leaves, these kind of sort of oval shaped leaves. And mistletoe grows in these clumps. So here around Oxford, we see trees that have these strange balls in them in the winter. Once the tree has lost its leaves, the mistletoe still remains. It's an evergreen plant, and so we find these clumps up high in the canopy. And this is European mistletoe, and it's very abundant here in the UK. You can grow in all sorts of different trees. But actually, mistletoe is a much broader term botanically, and it really refers to any plant which exhibits what we call aerial parasitism. So it's a plant which grows on another plant, a host tree, and it grows on the stems, actually in the air. So some parasitic plants will grow on the roots of a host. Mistletoes grow high up in the branches. And so there's not just one species of mistletoe, actually over 1,500 all across the globe. It's an extremely diverse group. You see that some have incredibly bright flowers, adaptations to attract pollinators, all sorts of pollinators, and then produce some incredible fruits which are spread by a wide range of seed dispersers. And you can also see that some have a much more reduced structure. They emerge from a host tree and seem to like creep out like aliens. They have these sort of scale-like leaves and tiny reduced flowers, because they don't need to invest a lot in a structure when the host is providing that structure for them. So actually, mistletoes are incredibly diverse. We're still naming new species of mistletoe, and it's any plant which grows on another plant and grows essentially on its stems in the air, and belongs to the order Santallales. So this is the sandalwood order. So if you have perfumes that are like sandalwood, mistletoe is actually within that group. And what we can see is that this group is polyphyletic. So essentially, that means that mistletoe is not just descendant from one common ancestor. This has actually evolved 5 times. So this kind of strange biology of growing up in the branches of a host tree is thought to have evolved on 5 separate occasions, and that is the most parsimonious. It's the clearest, most straightforward explanation of the evolution of mistletoes. So yeah, hopefully that clears up what a mistletoe is. We are going to largely be talking about European mistletoe as well, because that's what a lot of the folklore surrounds. But we are also going to be talking about different species throughout the talk, and much of what I'm saying also applies to these other species in this really diverse group. So I said that mistletoes are parasitic plants, and this is where sometimes the wording can get a little bit confusing. People use parasite to mean lots of different things. And if we take a super broad definition and say a bit more of an evolutionary definition, we think of parasites as any organism that lives in or on another organism, the host, and causes it some degree of harm. So in this way, if mistletoes are harmful, we'll get onto that, they can be lumped in with tapeworms, with pathogens like viruses, bacteria, fungi. And this has all sorts of implications for how we view them. We often view them as bad. This word parasite has a lot of negative connotations. But whether that's the case, we can talk about a little bit more. Botanically, though, a parasitic plant has a slightly more nuanced definition. Yes, it has a host, but to be called a parasitic plant, it needs to directly steal water or nutrients from this host, and it does this using this strange organ called a haustorium. Botanically, it's not quite a stem, it's not quite a root, it's sort of somewhere in between. And the best way to describe it is a physiological bridge that it used to connect to the host. So we can see here, actually, this is a micro CT scan of a Phoradendron mistletoe. That's a North American genus, growing on Taperira guyanensis, so a host tree, and it develops these teeth-like sinkers. So these teeth-like structures you can see is the mistletoe digging in. It's almost like a vampire, and it needs to dig in so it can steal the water and nutrients from it. You might be thinking, is something like ivy a parasitic plant? Because we might call it a parasite. It grows on something and it can harm it. But actually, unlike ivy, which doesn't need a host to survive, it could grow on a brick wall, for example. Mistletoe actually penetrates directly into the host and starts stealing things from it. So it's a bit more aggressive in its parasitism. It's not just having an indirect effect of, say, suffocating the host. So botanically, we would call mistletoe as a parasitic plant, but ivy, we wouldn't. So as with any parasite, we like to think about the life cycle. This gives us an idea about what happens in its biology, what does it need to survive, and how does it get around. So let's start with a mistletoe. We've got a lovely luscious mistletoe here, and it's got some nice white berries. Now, these berries need to find their way to a susceptible host tree. As I say, the mistletoe we have here can grow on a wide variety of trees. It loves apple trees, lime trees, poplars. Some trees it can grow on, but does so less rarely, so things like birch. Some trees it very, very rarely infects. So oak trees, for example, we estimate there are only 13 oak trees in the whole of the UK, which is quite interesting when we come on to some of the folklore around this. So how does a berry get onto a tree? Well, it's taken there by a bird. There's a few birds which spread mistletoe berries, mistle thrushes being one of the main culprits. So mistle thrushes get their name from the fact that they spread mistletoe. But also other thrushes like fieldfares and waxwings, and even some smaller birds like blackcaps will pick up the mistletoe berries and spread the seed. They do this in a couple of different ways. Mistle thrushes will actually eat the berries and poop out the seeds. This is called an endozoochorous mechanism, if you want the fancy term. Whereas blackcaps are a lot pickier. They'll eat the outer coating of the fruit, the epicarp, but they'll leave the seed intact, and they'll wipe it directly. Think of them as like the picky kids that don't want to eat the crusts. They'll wipe it directly onto the branch. And this is brilliant for the mistletoe because it's a lot more efficient than the mistle thrushes just pooping out the seeds in the mistletoe, hoping that it lands on a suitable branch. Okay, so they'll land on a branch, and then they form this very strange alien-like structure. I think they look a little bit like Shrek's ears, to be honest. But mistletoes, the seeds will send out these what we call hypocotyls, these early stems, and the stems will bend round and start to expand. This forms something called a holdfast, if you like, and that is what anchors it, starts anchoring it to the host. And that's when the mistletoe is starting to penetrate and starting to see whether it can establish or not. The host can start to occlude the mistletoe cells at this point. Maybe the mistletoe can't quite get a hold, but this will occur, and from then the mistletoe starts growing inside the host. A couple of years later, it'll emerge as a clump, these round clumps that we see. And each year, the stems will split in two. So this is what forms our ball-like structure. Each year, they can grow in all directions. They're not constrained by gravity like a normal plant is, or at least not in the same way. And so they will just grow outwards in all directions. Over time, you can get transmission of the mistletoe berries within the plant. So either them falling down, what we call seed rain, maybe birds transmit them within the tree, and you can also get asexual reproduction. So once that haustorium forms, that physiological bridge inside the tree which connects the mistletoe to the host, then the mistletoe can actually send out adventitious shoots under the bark and pop up further down. So when you get these really big infestations like we see in this apple tree, a lot of these are probably asexual clones as well. So that completes the life cycle of the typical Viscum album mistletoe we see here in the UK. But of course, there are variations on this. Mistletoes all over the world are dispersed by different agents. Their seeds are dispersed by different agents. They're pollinated by different species. So this species here, Glossophaga, is actually pollinated. Sorry, Psittacanthus acinarius is pollinated by Glossophaga bats. So quite strange in their biology. There are some mistletoes which have their seeds dispersed by marsupials in Australia. So the thing that connects them, though, is this idea that mistletoes never touch the ground. Throughout their entire life cycle, they're always in the air in one way or another. Now, I mentioned briefly that the mistletoe we have here can grow on lots of different trees, and that's true. Actually, over 230 different flowering tree species. It's a super generalist. It's brilliant at growing on all sorts of trees, even some that aren't very closely related to one another. And this is the particular subspecies of Viscum album, subspecies album. But this is not the case. Just like lots of parasites vary in the hosts and the host ranges that they exploit, Viscum album is no different. So actually there is a subspecies of Viscum album on the continent in Europe, not found here in the UK for reasons unknown, that only grows on gymnosperms, only grows on conifers, things like Scots pine and larch, and a much smaller subset of species. Even further, closely related species Viscum cruciatum grows on a smaller number of flowering trees, and there's even a subspecies of Viscum album that is only found on one tree, Pinus halepensis, over in Crete. So even within the same genus of mistletoe, there is such variation in host specificity. My research is interested as to why. At least part of my research anyway. So you can see here these different ranges of the different mistletoes we see. The only ones we have in the UK are this subspecies album, and these are growing on a wide variety of host trees. And then right down in Crete here, we get the tiny restricted range of Viscum creticum. But why they have these different hosts is unknown. Could it be to do with the birds that are spreading them? Could it be to do with some kind of genetic or physiological compatibility with the host? Could it be to do with host abundance? I mean, that's less likely because the hosts seem to be all throughout this region. But trying to understand those mechanisms by which different mistletoes are interacting with different hosts has been part of our research. So, for example, we have done a reciprocal transplant experiment down at the Arboretum, the Harcourt Arboretum, where we took different host trees and inoculated them with these different mistletoes. Basically, just going to see what happens. We've found that they don't germinate preferentially on different hosts. They seem to just germinate wherever they can. But there's probably something later which will allow some to establish and others not. You can see here our experiment is kind of blown up. You have to have quite a large sample size because establishment rates can be quite low. So this was my spring of potting a load of trees and planting a load of berries. And now we're left with a much smaller number. I think there's only about 17 that are still viable. That's 17 berries, not even 17 trees. So this is the kind of experiment that will hopefully allow us to see how different mistletoes can establish on different trees. And this relates to broader questions about parasites and the kind of hosts they can grow on and why, and the evolution of host specificity. Actually trying to understand how this is occurring and the mechanism underpinning the ability of mistletoe to establish, we're going to use a combination of micro-CT scanning and histology to get a good look at that physiological interaction between the two organisms. So this is just one example of how mistletoe is telling us a little bit more about parasitism in general, and how actually, even though this species has been studied for hundreds and thousands of years, there's still things we don't know, quite big questions. Anyway, I said I'd talk a little bit about whether it is actually a parasite. Is it actually harmful, even though we call it a parasitic plant botanically? And indeed, it can be an issue. So if you go over to Herefordshire, Shropshire, Gloucestershire, you'll see orchards that are absolutely covered in mistletoe, mass infestations, because mistletoe loves to grow on apple trees, sort of perfect conditions for it. And orchards are these nice open spaces with lots of light. Birds love perching there. So you end up with these big infestations pretty quickly. And they can be an issue if they're not managed sustainably. So historically, people would cut down mistletoe, maybe sell it at Christmas. But actually, if mistletoes aren't managed regularly, they can completely take over, reduce fruit crop, and actually damage the trees. The mistletoe that grows on pine in Europe and different species in North America can be even more of an issue. So they can cause crown dieback and can even be a major cause of mortality in pine forests. So mistletoe, yes, it can cause a lot of harm, but it's not all bad. As we've already discussed, they provide important food for birds, especially at a time of year where there isn't as much food available. So brilliant for migrants and resident birds over the winter. And they can even provide nesting sites as well for those birds. But the birds aren't the only organisms that benefit from mistletoe. There are also endemic insects, which are only found on mistletoe. So this is the mistletoe marble moth. And it's actually of conservation interest because it's very rare. It's only found on mistletoe. You can see these strange sort of larval mines that develop from the larvae of the moth. And there are also 5 other species of insect which are only found associated with mistletoe here in the UK. But even broader than that, mistletoes are brilliant for the ecosystem. And this is because they are very good at 2 things. The first is they promote nutrient cycling. So when mistletoes lose their leaves, and they do so after they've grown new ones, so they are actually evergreen, but they will lose old leaves after new ones have formed. Most trees, or most plants in general, if they're deciduous, when they lose their leaves, they will suck all of the nutrients out of them before they let them go. They want to make the most of all those precious nutrients. But mistletoes, they're kind of greedy. They'll just keep stealing from the host. So they don't actually break down all that chlorophyll and all those other nutrients within the leaf. They just let it go. And as they do, they actually readily cycle nutrients back into the soil underneath them. So this is a seed trap that we set up. And even though it was set up to collect seeds, we ended up collecting a load of leaves as well, because the leaf fall is just so great underneath some of these mistletoes. And per meter square, they're actually contributing a lot of nitrogen back to the soil, which is brilliant for the organisms living there, the plants and the fauna living in the soil. So nutrient cycling is one thing. Another way that they're actually considered a keystone species is that they will sometimes suppress dominant host species in the ecosystem. So trees which would otherwise take over are maybe weakened a little bit. And this is a general role that parasites are thought to play in regulating other host species. So whereas one species, if it's not constrained by a parasite, might completely take over others and outcompete them, with that parasite, it's actually less competitive. And that improves biodiversity on the whole for the ecosystem. So lots of brilliant pluses for biodiversity, even though mistletoe is a parasite. And this has been recognised. In some parts of the world, people are saying we actually need to conserve mistletoes. So like here in Melbourne, lots of mistletoes were removed. And so they've been reintroduced. They recognise that mistletoe is great for the ecosystem, great for the birds, great for the surrounding vegetation. And so they've actually replanted some of these. And this has been a big success. But let's think beyond the impacts on our ecosystem. Let's think, what can mistletoe do for science? You know, as I say, I'm here to convince you that mistletoe is far more than just this Christmas, this romantic Christmas tradition. And one of the things which has come out recently is that mistletoe is fascinating from a genomic perspective. Mistletoe has the largest genome in Britain and Ireland, and you see this represented here. So this is a diagram which is using a very tiny square, that blue square, if you can see that. That represents your genome. So those are all the instructions that make you who you are, just in that little square there. And that's size. That's about 3 billion base pairs worth of DNA. And the mistletoe genome, on the same scale, is this big. It's 30 times the size. It's about 90 billion base pairs worth of DNA across 10 chromosomes. So these are absolutely massive chromosomes. Our DNA is about a third to a quarter the size of a mistletoe chromosome. And why? We're still figuring out. So it's thought that maybe this is linked to its parasitic lifestyle. Usually genomes are constrained from getting large because selfish elements can damage the rest of the genome. Selfish elements being those genes, those DNA that will self-replicate in the genome and start to interrupt other parts of the genome. But mistletoe doesn't seem to be showing this same level of constraint. Maybe that's because it can have more of its metabolic functions disrupted when it's dependent on a host for a lot of those core processes. Just one hypothesis, but in all honesty, we don't really know. It's actually, as far as I'm aware, the largest genome that we have sequenced to date. And it uses this genome to do all sorts of wacky things. So it can produce a lot of complex chemicals, including some toxins. So yes, even though we associate mistletoe with love, it is toxic. Do not go around eating the berries after you pick them. Do not go eating the leaves. Even though the mistletoe we have here is typically not going to kill you, you might end up in hospital. So these are the kind of things that the mistletoe can produce using its genome. Also, it seems to do some other things quite strangely. So it's one of the only organisms we've found that's completely lost complex 1 in the electron transport chain. So for those of you that remember oxidative phosphorylation as a mechanism of producing ATP, sort of towards the end of aerobic respiration in the mitochondrion, it's completely lost this pathway. And again, we don't know why, probably linked to its increased dependency on the host. It also has weird photosynthesis. So even though it's not able to produce the same level of ATP, or it's doing it in some other way, it's even lost one of the photosystem 1 complexes and the NDH complex. So we compare it in this schematic to Arabidopsis here. So it's doing some very strange things biochemically. And this has led lots of people to believe, well, maybe it can be useful in medicine too. But before we come on to that, mistletoe isn't just important scientifically at the genomic level, it's also useful as a host parasite model system. So asking questions about the ecology and evolution of parasites can be quite difficult because you can't see them. We can't see what they're doing, we can't see how they're interacting with the host, but mistletoe is completely different. We can see it very clearly. We can see where these clumps are, how they're growing, whether they're surviving or not. And so mistletoe is an example of what we call a vector-borne macroparasite. Okay, so this is drone footage here in Silwood Park, and all these little green clumps or individual mistletoes that we can track year on year. And we actually did this for the last 10 years, and we measured their rates of survival, as do you appear in the next year? Are you still here, essentially? Their rates of growth if they survive by looking at the images we take, so relative change in size of the mistletoe from the picture, and whether they're fruiting or not. And just a little note about fruiting, that actually mistletoe is what we call a dioecious species. So it has separate male and female individuals, and only the females will fruit. Only about 10% of plants will do this. Just another quirky thing about this species, one of many. Okay, so using that data, we can ask questions about parasite dynamics and how parasites spread and the kind of things that influence its survival, growth, and reproduction. So I've not got many graphs in this presentation, but just a couple to illustrate my point. One of the things that we found was actually that larger mistletoes are more likely to survive. So there's a statistically significant relationship. But at the same time, if you're higher up in the tree, you're less likely to survive. So the mistletoes higher up are less likely to survive. And we think that this is because the higher up mistletoes are more vulnerable to the wind blowing the branches, but they're also more vulnerable to a risk of something called embolism. So as the mistletoe steals water from the tree, puts it under a lot of hydraulic stress, and this can actually increase the risk of cavitation, so the formation of an air bubble in the xylem, and that can lead to embolism, where the xylem is blocked off and the mistletoe can no longer survive, and it actually damages the tree in the process too. So they're kind of getting potentially too greedy for their own good. Okay, so that's quite interesting, because often when we model parasites, we think that they're all the same, but what we can show here is actually that depending on these other factors, like how big they are and where they're found in the host, their survival can be impacted. We also use the system to investigate trade-offs. So trade-offs are famously hard to measure. So this is where if you invest in one part of your life cycle, you can't invest as much in another part of your life cycle. And what we found here really clearly, for example, is that the more a mistletoe grew, the less likely it was to fruit. So mistletoes clearly investing more or less in growth or reproduction, depending on where they are in their life cycle. This might seem like a fairly obvious point, but actually ecologists have really struggled to find empirical evidence for this. So it's quite nice when this result came out. And finally, I don't know if any of you are demographers, but one of the ways that we classify how organisms invest in different parts of their life cycle, and how we classify organisms across the entire tree of life more generally, are using these life history strategies. So one of the classic life history strategy frameworks is the RK continuum, so R selected or K selected species. But a more modern equivalent is a fast slow continuum, which describes, do you have a longer generation time, more investment in getting big but fewer offspring, and also the reproductive strategy. Are you reproducing lots in your life cycle or at very rare events? And these axes of variation can be used to describe how organisms from any kingdom invest in different parts of the life cycle. And so this is a principal component analysis which puts together a load of data on the life cycles of 319 plants. And I wanted to see, well, where does mistletoe fall on this? So using our study, we added mistletoe to this data set, and we found that, yet again, mistletoe is doing something quite strange. So they seem to be on the edge of these life history strategies, how organisms are investing in different parts of the life cycle. It's a very new result, so we're just trying to figure out why. But this is to broadly say that mistletoe can tell us lots about how organisms evolve and how they invest in different parts of their life history, much more than just what parasites can do. But beyond that, it also has some more practical applications. So medically, mistletoe has been used for thousands of years. You can buy mistletoe tea online. You might be thinking, why can I drink mistletoe tea even though I can't eat it because it's toxic? Well, actually, it's thought that the heating process and the drying process will denature some of the proteins, the toxic proteins, which could be harmful. So you're probably safe with mistletoe tea, but do check the label. And in this case, mistletoe tea has been found to be really good for hypertension, and so it's actually sold in pharmacies on the continent quite readily. But more recently, it's also been proposed as possible cancer treatment. So most things in nature that can harm you have also been associated with things that can heal you. And in the same way, because mistletoe produces lots of complex compounds using its very odd genome, it's produced some chemicals like lectins, which have promise in cancer treatment. The results are currently mixed, but show fairly good promise. It's not a commonly used substance, mistletoe extract, but it is currently being refined and continually tested. So now on to some of the other aspects of mistletoe history. And actually, mistletoe has a long association because people have been fascinated by this plant, which seemingly appears from nowhere. And this included the Vikings. So if you look into Norse mythology, you'll find a very famous tale of Balder and the mistletoe. And Balder was a Greek god whose mother, Frigg, wanted to protect. And she said that everything on the ground you will be invincible to. So nothing could kill Balder. People started throwing rocks and glass and all sorts at him, and he survived. But I don't know if any of you have watched Thor, and even if you've not, you might know Loki is the god of mischief, and thought, well, I don't like that Balder is getting away with all this. I don't like that he is seemingly invincible. And so he went and found something, the one thing that never touched the ground, and that was mistletoe, that he wasn't protected from. He tied mistletoe to a spear and threw it straight through Balder's heart and killed him. And it's thought that the tears from Frigg's face, from Balder's mother's face, resembled the white berries of the mistletoe. It's quite a tragic but somewhat romantic tale of mistletoe in culture there. But it's actually then progressed from that. So back in Druidic times, people also thought mistletoe was sacred. Again, appeared from nowhere, and they saw this as a sign of fertility. So Pliny the Elder wrote about a ritual where people would cut down mistletoe with a golden sickle, and it would bring good fertility to all the livestock and a good harvest for the year. And then people would drink mistletoe tea and feed it to animals to try and improve their animal husbandry. And so this is classically what is referred to as the oak and the mistletoe ritual. The perceptive among you might have noticed, though, that I said earlier, mistletoe very, very rarely grows on oak. So this is quite a strange thing to reconcile. We think that maybe Pliny was writing about a slightly different species of mistletoe, which does grow on oak more readily. That's a Loranthus europaeus. But we're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on here. Either way, very cool, strange thing, and it's still done today. There is a mistletoe ritual in Tenbury Wells in Herefordshire that is very widely attended and celebrated. They even have a mistletoe queen that wears a mistletoe crown, and some people are very, very much into all of this. Even across the world, though, mistletoe has been revered as sacred. And Caribbean herbalists of African descent in Jamaica referred to mistletoe as godbush back in the 1900s. And so this is Oryctanthus cordifolius. It was a very alien-looking plant. No wonder they thought it was something otherworldly, closely related to the ones that the herbalists would have been describing. So it's important historically. It's even used still today for other traditions. So the complex interactions between the mistletoe and host form these kind of flower-like patterns. And we call these wood roses, and some of them carve them into very pretty sculptures like this hen. And there's a quote by Erasmus which said that the thrush himself excretes his own trouble. And this was in reference to the use of mistletoes in actually quite a barbaric practice called birdlime, where you would produce a sticky substance to try and capture birds and then kill them. This was actually only outlawed in France a few years ago, but it's historically something people have used mistletoe for, if one of the less nice uses. And of course, we associate mistletoe with kissing at Christmas. The actual origins of this are unclear, but it's thought that the association historically with fertility is what transitioned into a more popular tradition in the Victorian era of kissing under the mistletoe and taking a berry for each kiss that was stolen. And even today, mistletoe features in just about every Christmas song about love, even this 2011 banger by Justin Bieber, who made a whole album named after it. So yeah, historically, mistletoe has always been in people's minds for all sorts of different things. But it all comes back to, in the end, the fact that it seemingly appears in the trees, even though now we know that that's the bird spreading them and that's its parasitic lifestyle, that strange biology is at the heart of all of its use in history and across different cultures. So I like to see mistletoe as a plant of extremes. You know, it has these extreme physiological adaptations, strange biology, massive genome, does weird things biochemically. It's associated with love, but also death. It's a keystone species, but it's also a parasite. And so I think for me, choosing to do a 3-year DPhil on one species, I've chosen a pretty good one to get quite a lot of variety. And it's actually interesting, you speak to people from different parts of the country and of different backgrounds. Some absolutely love mistletoe, some absolutely loathe it. So it's not just for Christmas. Hopefully I've convinced you of that. But I just want to spend a few minutes also talking about the future of mistletoe, because actually our ecosystems are responding to an incredible amount of change, be it due to land use change or due to climate change, mixture of both and other threats as well. And mistletoe is not exempt from all of these changes to our ecosystems. To try and understand where mistletoe will be in the future, where it will be found and how it will be impacting our ecosystems, we need to know where it is today. But our data for this aren't too great. So the last major national survey of mistletoe was done in the 1990s. The results were pretty patchy. People would send in records like mistletoe, I've found some by the church down the lane, which wasn't very accurate. They'd also record the wrong species that it's growing on. They'd say lots were growing on oak when we know that that wasn't the case. So we need an update. At the same time, our models of mistletoe so far, even though we have built some simple ones fairly recently, they ignore the impacts of the birds. So this is quite a simple species distribution model showing where mistletoe is expected to spread to under different climate scenarios. So we see predicted suitability in the first panel here in A, and then as the potential future warms to varying degrees, we see mistletoe spread further or less far in different directions. And what we generally see here is a more northward shift at hotter temperatures, and some of the more southern inhabited areas become less suitable. It's quite subtle here. But of course, over the course of decades and even centuries, we might see a fairly dramatic shift at the local level. So trying to predict these changes is important because we know mistletoe is having lots of impacts on different ecosystems. We need new models and we need new understanding of where mistletoe is. To do this, we've launched a citizen science project called mistletoe. So think of Pokemon Go. And this is something that you can get involved in as well. For more information, you can scan the QR code that explains how to get involved. But just briefly, this is an app-based survey run through Survey 123. And it's very simple. You just click on the app and you can continue without signing in. And when you've installed the mistletoe survey onto your app via the website, it will be here. And then you can just reuse it time and time again. You click on the app and you start to collect data. Now, crucially, this data will automatically record where you are. Great, so we can get accurate records of where the mistletoe is. And it will also give you the chance to record how much mistletoe there is and send in a photo so we can actually verify that what you found is correct. So if you scroll down here, you'll see a few example photos and it actually outlines the kind of thing that you're looking for. Now, when you find a tree with some mistletoe in, you can then take a photo of it. So here is me stood outside my department and I found a tree that's got some mistletoe clumps in it. And I want to take a photo of it. So get the tree in the frame, and you can see here that all these dark sort of circles backlit by the sky are mistletoe clumps. And so I'll take a photo of that, submit that, and then you can add in details of roughly how much mistletoe there are. That's really helpful for us because one mistletoe in a tree is going to be able to contribute a lot less to future mistletoe distribution than say 100, and you can get some really massive infestations. So you fill in that information, and that's the key part of the survey. You can also add in the kind of habitat it's growing in. If you know the kind of tree it's growing in, you can say if there's large areas which haven't got any mistletoe, and other observations as well. So quite an easy way of contributing some science and some nice a nice activity to do on your winter walk. We'll then use this data. So this was some preliminary data from last year showing roughly where we got records in from. We'll use those data of where mistletoe is, relatively how abundant it is in a particular area, because that's going to determine its potential for spread, and overlay this with bird data to crucially understand the potential of mistletoe to spread into new areas, because of course it can't spread if the birds aren't there to spread it. So hopefully I've given you a bit of an indication that mistletoe is important. It's not just another Christmas plant. It's a keystone species. It's scientifically fascinating. It's medically important. It's culturally at the heart of so many traditions, and so I think it deserves to be revered as this incredible organism. For all those same reasons, it is fascinating. It's still telling us so much more about parasitism and about the kind of extremes of biology, and it's still changing. Its future is uncertain, even though we think it's probably going to expand in this country. Some species are in decline, and this can have real consequences for the organisms that depend on it, and can have major rippling impacts throughout different communities. So for anyone that's keen, a load of literature that this talk was based off. I'd just like to acknowledge my incredible supervisors, collaborators, funding partners, and other supporting organisations. And thank you all for listening. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ollie, for a wonderful, intriguing, and beautiful lecture, which has covered such the ground with such eloquence. And thank you very much indeed. That's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
I'm going to be a bit cheeky, and I'm going to take the preference of the first question. We were having a little joke earlier about the fact that Ollie's moved from St. Cat's to Linico, and his subject is actually observable between them, and in the university parks as well. There's loads of many of his colleagues, of course, to go to remote locations. But really, my question is that you were talking about all these different species, but how big is the mistletoe community research-wise? I mean, how many people are working on it? I get the impression this might be quite a lonely and solitary job, given
Yeah,
the
so
amount that we know about the UK ones. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So actually, you'd be surprised. I went to a very niche conference this year, in Japan, the International Parasitic Plant Society, um, and there were all sorts of different parasitic plant biologists around, and there was a table for the mistletoe scientists, and so we got about six of us on there, all from different continents, and actually. So it's not a massive community, but it's not entirely lonely. And lots of people have kind of dabbled in mistletoe research as well. So you find that it brings in people from all sorts of background. I was more trained as an ecologist, but botanists have gone to study mistletoe. You have ornithologists that are interested in the impacts on birds, community ecologists impacts in the wider ecosystem impacts. So actually, you get mistletoe researchers from far and wide.
Okay, really multidisciplinary. Right, thank you. Well, we've got a number of questions. What I'm going to do, I'll try and sort of join them all together a bit so that so there's a couple here from Leslie and Alex, particularly, who are interested in in why the genome is so big and what that might be, and whether it's a result of the lack of resource constraint, or would like to say a little bit more about that, how it relates to other plant pathogenic species big? These are.
Yeah. So as far as I'm aware, there isn't a major trend in terms of parasitic plants having really big genomes. This does seem to be somewhat anomalous in Viscum album. Um, the exact reasons, I will be honest, I don't think we know yet. I've read through the papers looking for an explanation. But it is possible that often when we see these explosions, it is a lack of regulation, a lack of regulatory mechanisms, and maybe those regulatory mechanisms have disappeared because they're dependent on the host for so much. Indeed, what we typically see as parasites become more dependent on a host is gene loss, not gene gain. They seem to lose functions because they don't need them. In this case, though, that seems to have led to an expansion of all these selfish elements that are replicating. That's the general hypothesis and thought, but mistletoe was only sequenced a couple of years ago, and so those kind of hypotheses have not actually been tested. It's a very exciting area of research, and I'm actually collaborating with Royal Botanic Garden at Edinburgh to do some more sequencing of the intra-specific variation within Viscum album. So hopefully that will give us a bit more of an indication as to what's going on.
Okay, oh, that's fascinating. Well, another couple of questions here actually are really on the theme of sort of species and host range, and these come from Helen, Carol, and Alistair. So, thinking about host range, do parasitize other sandalwoods? Is there anything going on in North American species? Is another question from Dawn. And how common is dwarf mistletoe in Canada? So, and do we know why they don't affect some and they do others? So, what's the host range around the world? There's a lot
Yeah.
of interest.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the questions I find most fascinating because we just see so much variation. We do actually find some mistletoes that are very specialized, not just to the host, but actually to the particular uh, particular vectors they use, or the seed dispersers that spread the seeds, and particular pollinators as well. So we can get these 3, 4, 5-way interactions between different species that are fairly specific. In terms of do they parasitize other sandalwoods? Yes, actually, Viscum album can partake in something called autoparasitism. It can actually parasitize members of its own species. So you can get a host with a mistletoe on it, and then a mistletoe grows on the mistletoe. And so that's actually a form of cannibalism. So again, very strange. It's rare, but it does occur. And they can also grow on other mistletoes. And so you'll find hosts with a certain load of leaves, different leaves on the mistletoe, different leaves on the what we call hyperparasite, the mistletoe on the mistletoe. It can get quite confusing quite quickly. So they certainly can parasitize other sandalwoods, most of which are parasitic. In terms of dwarf mistletoes, so dwarf mistletoes, Archiphobium, are a major pest in North America. I don't know the exact extent in Canada, but I am aware that they are an issue, I believe, in the Pacific Northwest of the US. And they're one of the only genera of mistletoes that are actually spread by something called ballochory. So they are spread by these explosive seeds, which will eject out at super rapid speeds and they'll actually latch on to other trees nearby. So they're some of the only mistletoes that aren't dependent on birds for that. So quite quirky. They are quite harmful to a lot of the trees that they grow on, and they are considered a major pest in some of those forests, and do need to be controlled more tightly than the mistletoe we have here in the UK, which is less harmful. As for general host specificity around the world, it does vary a lot with different species, but a lot of the ones in the tropics are massively understudied. We don't have a good idea of the host range because we've only seen them on limited hosts, and actually defining that host range is very difficult because if you've not seen it growing on a host and you've not cultured it yourself on a host, you don't know whether it can. And so only the species which have been studied a lot more readily, things like Viscum album and Phorodendron lycarpum, they are the ones which we have a bit more of a clear idea of what they can grow on.
Okay, well, I've got a couple of supplementaries actually on some of those questions. So there's Bob from Edinburgh wondering how abundant it is in Scotland.
Yeah, so we do see a little bit of mistletoe in Scotland. We've had a couple of records in, but not as much. Climate is an important factor for where mistletoe can grow, and if the winters get below -7 degrees, it's a commonly quoted temperature, is too cold for them. So up in Scotland, and particularly up at higher altitudes, mistletoe really struggles. Having said that, there's a local population near Edinburgh Botanic Garden because people have introduced it at the Botanic Garden, and it seems to still be doing okay.
Yeah, it's sort of remarkable to think of it as both an introduced and reintroduced species when you were talking about it being introduced. So that's interesting. So, and then there's just from Audrey, another supplementary on the genome side before I want to move on to another topic is do we know what the relationships are to the genomes in other sandalwoods? Do they all have large genomes, or have we simply not sequenced all the sandalwoods yet? Do we?
I don't think we know. I don't know of any other sandalwoods that have been sequenced. Maybe someone else does. But I don't think that this is I think this is something that people are still exploring.
Oh, excellent. And so I'd like to move on to the last topic. I think, and I'll probably have to close after this because we're running out of time. But so Malcolm's asking about photosynthesis, saying obviously it's green, so it's synthesizing even if it's a faulty process. But how dependent is it in its own photosynthesis and get nutrients? I mean, presumably it photosynthesizes in the winter, does it? Because that's when, you'd imagine it's shaded during the summer. But
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, even though it does have more access to the outside in the winter when it's not being blocked by the tree's leaves, its growing season is still in the spring. So maybe it's does some of that photosynthesis just as the host leaves are appearing again to kind of get that balance between access of light and its own growing season. So yes, it does take carbon from the host. It was commonly thought that it didn't, but it does. And this was more revealed over the last 10, 15 years or so. It's what we call a hemiparasite. I don't really like that term. I think it's a bit misleading. But it can photosynthesize to an extent, but it's clearly also not entirely dependent on that. And there seems to be, there doesn't seem to be much selection for it to keep a very sophisticated photosynthetic apparatus because it doesn't need it. It can still steal some carbon from the host. So there are some parasitic plants which steal a lot more carbon and have completely lost the ability to photosynthesize. But mistletoe still seems to be fairly greedy.
Okay, right now we are out of time, so I'm going to take chairman's privilege to ask the last question a bit cheekily. But do you see a life in mistletoe ahead of you now? You're graduate student. Is this your? Do you think this is going to be your life's work, or do you think you might move on to other things afterwards?
I love mistletoe, but I have an interest in. I'm more broadly interested in host parasite interaction. So what I would actually like to do is look comparatively at different systems and maybe see whether whether the same theory can apply to mistletoes that it also can to, say, HIV or malaria, or all sorts of different pathogens. So that's kind of where my head's at. But I'd love to. I'm always down for a conversation about mistletoe and parasitic plants. They certainly have my heart.
Okay, well, just to say once again, thank you so much, Ollie, for a wonderful exposition. I think an excellent example of the work that's going on in the department. It's cross-disciplinarity, its breadth, and how it works, and how also we're addressing subjects that some in many ways understudied, which are many of the most interesting ones. So thank you once again. Thank you all for joining. I see many of you still with us and all the way through. Thank you. I hope and look forward to introducing next year's lecture, which will be, as I say, a hybrid venture. So I hope I will see some of you, and nice to see the applause, very well deserved. Thank you very much, Oliver and Ollie, and thank you all for listening, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.